When I first started playing Elden Ring, I thought of it as Dark Souls, Breath of the Wild. Souls were now called runes, bonfires were sites of grace, but it was ultimately just a fancy next-gen update with a bunch of arbitrary terminology and surreal imagery. Nothing embodied the surreal imagery better than the two fingers, which were originally told our sage advisors speaking on behalf of the greater will. But then we see them. Giant, hairy, literal fingers, twitching almost imperceptibly as an old woman beckons us to enter the room and hear their wisdom. The standard dismissive line among my friends at the time, whenever we encountered something sufficiently creepy and strange in the game, was, well, George R. R. Martin must have written that part. But the image of the fingers stuck in my head as I continued playing. There was a feeling of inscrutable intent behind them. These things were too deliberate, too uncannily alien, yet familiar to just be a surreal image. And as I continued playing, I became convinced that Elden Ring had a real, meaningful storyline hidden inside of it, which meant there was a reason why the envoys of the Greater Will were fingers. There was a reason why the glimmering golden resources I used to level up were called runes. And there was a reason why Queen Marika had been chosen to become a god, and yet had shattered the Elden Ring and fractured reality. I knew that there was a real artistic vision behind the game, but I couldn't see what it was. Now I can. I can see how the most important aspects of Elden Ring's world can weave together to form a greater whole. So I'm going to do something unorthodox. Rather than a lore video that narrows in on a specific topic, I'm going to zoom out and connect the major threads of lore to craft a complete interpretation of one of the most enigmatic storylines in gaming history. Come with me, and let's discuss. But first, some preamble. Despite the bombastic title, my goal is not to arrive at the unassailable truth of Elden Ring, but to find connections that will allow us, with moderate speculation, to pull together a deeper understanding of the lore. If you're new to Elden Ring lore, I strongly recommend creators like VatiVidya and Smotown that carefully and deliberately go through what we know as a player community. Instead, I'm going to take all these established data points as a basis upon which to build an interpretation. Needless to say, that means extensive spoilers for Elden Ring, but I suspect you knew that. If it feels like I'm going off the deep end at some point, well, maybe I am. But I'm choosing the points to speculate about with purpose. The goal is for each bit of speculation to pay dividends as a tool to enrich our interpretation and allow us to answer questions that often get left unanswered. So let's begin with a question I asked myself in the first few minutes of the game. What are runes? As you play Elden Ring, you collect runes from every enemy you defeat, and once you meet Melina, you can use those runes to level up, increasing your strength or dexterity or intelligence. But this terminology never made sense to me. In our world, runes are essentially letters, fragments of words. How do you turn runes into strength? The meaning of these words in the Bible is a subject for theologians to debate, but some authors have made them quite literal in the context of their own worlds. In the world of Earthsea, by Ursula K. Le Guin, all of creation is made out of words, and magic is done by learning the true name of a thing. That is, its name in the world-making language. Dragons can speak the language of creation natively in Earthsea, so they can breathe fire simply by opening their mouth and saying the word fire. This is also how the dragon speech in Skyrim functions, and the Kingkiller Chronicles and other fantasy series make use of the idea of true names. It's easy to see why the idea of a world made out of words is so appealing to a fantasy author. Not only is it poetic, but in a sense it's true. Earthsea actually is a world made entirely out of words. There's a meta-narrative harmony in a story like this. So what does this have to do with Elden Ring? Well, the biblical influence on Elden Ring is pretty clear when we look at the image of Marika crucified upon a rune arc. But there's something deeper at work here. I think runes are fragments of the language of creation. They are words. Words that impart upon a body knowledge of how to be alive. Instructions for life. Perhaps the words that bind a soul and body together. For that matter, we do have instructions for life built into our bodies in the real world, in the form of DNA, which is its own kind of language. If this is right, if runes are a kind of primordial, life-giving language, it explains why they can be found in every living thing in the lands between. And it even makes sense that collecting more runes can make it possible to update the rules of your body to become stronger, faster, or smarter. But what kind of language are we talking about? Consider the swirling, almost dance-like script visible in an item like the Cypherpata. This same swirling script is visible within the Elden Ring itself if you view it in sufficiently high resolution. Consider that the messengers of the Greater Will are voiceless fingers, and that the person who seems to understand the Golden Order better than anyone else, the noble Gold Mask, never speaks, but only communicates with subtle motions of his body. The language of creation, it seems, is a form of sign language. It is shape and motion itself. As such, spoken words will only ever be able to approximate the deepest truths of the world, which are expressed through motion, through action. This is a fitting underlying reality for a world set within a video game, for an experience that you can only appreciate by playing it. In fact, this is an allegory quite similar to the fantasy world made of words, because meta-narratively, the world of Elden Ring quite literally was made by the motion of fingers. Thousands of fingers tapping out an impossibly complex pattern onto keyboards and making arcane gestures with computer mice. As players, we also interact with the world of Elden Ring using our fingers. So the idea that people inside this world can only understand the distant, mysterious intentions of outer beings by interpreting the motion of fingers is an uncannily organic metaphor for the actual relationship between us as players and the character we control. We even have characters like Ranni express resentment about her lack of free will, as her destiny is controlled by the fingers. There's a lot more I can say about the thematic relevance of the fingers, but I'll save that for later. For now, it suffices to say that, like most people, my initial reaction to the two fingers was repulsion, and mild shock at how literal their title was. But now, the more I think about it, the more strangely interesting I think this design choice is. This can tell us even more about the world, though. If the language of creation is a kind of sign language, then it implies this is a world in which a shape or emotion that represents some aspect of reality invokes that aspect on a deep level. This seems to be intrinsic to the nature of magic in Elden Ring, as all spells show a visual crest or symbol related to the kind of magic invoked when cast. In such a world, monumental architecture is also more than just symbolic, as visual symbolism itself has metaphysical significance. This might also explain the significance of eyes as a connection to the divine, because eyes can perceive this golden language when ears cannot. Notably, the most ear-themed character in the game is Gideon, the All-Knowing, and his reliance on word of mouth, on indirectly gathering facts, as symbolized by the ear-shaped ornamentation on his armor, may represent the idea that Gideon, despite knowing many facts, lacks true wisdom. You might be wondering, well, how do you pick up something as abstract as a word and put it in your inventory? And this, I think, is where the concept of gold comes in. We constantly hear about the golden order in the game and the grace of gold, so it's easy to see all this as colorful phrases for the same thing, the current order of the world. But then we get descriptions like the Minor Erdtree incantation, which says it contains the kindness of gold without order. So apparently gold and order are separate things, and the golden order is made of their union. I have a long version of this, but the short version is that I think gold is an underlying force of life, and it's capable of manifesting runes as golden runes, as a tangible thing you can pick up, and which can be used to heal or nourish a person. This golden manifestation is a memory of the language of shape and motion being expressed, like all recorded languages. And there's definitely a thematic connection between gold and memory. Also note that when you pick up golden runes, they're always inside of a body, even if it's a dead body. Somehow, a body being a vessel for runes is important. In any case, we can understand why the golden blessings of the Erdtree would be so revered by the people of the lands between, if it allows them to interact with the language of life itself and use that to heal or strengthen people. In summary, runes are literal words. They are the instructions for life, the rules for a living thing, and golden fragments of this language can be collected after something dies. Okay, so then what are great runes? Great runes are the primary object of our journey. They are initially described to us as shards of the Elden Ring, and we are told that if we can collect enough of them, we can use them to reforge the Elden Ring and repair the world. The Elden Ring itself is essentially a set of rules for all of reality to follow. So naturally, the great runes that make it up seem to be those various rules and principles, individually. Normal runes are rules for a single living thing. Great runes are the rules for multiple living things. However, the great runes are more than just pieces of a whole. They clearly have power on their own, as the opening cinematic tells us that the great runes granted each of the demigods newfound power that led to a great civil war, the Shattering. We can deduce some of these newfound powers by implication. For example, Radahn appears to be a large person before the Shattering, but when we encounter him, he's absolutely enormous, and his size seems to reflect his connection to the powers of gravity, which he uses to hold back meteors, and to ride his comically undersized horse. Mikola, another shard-bearer, is said to have always been a charming person, but his ability to magically charm and compel many people at once is shown to be connected to his Great Rune, because the charm breaks when his Great Rune shatters in the DLC. Melania, meanwhile, was said to be afflicted with the scarlet rot from birth, but there aren't really references to her spreading this rot and afflicting others prior to the Shattering War. During her confrontation with Radahn, she blooms, and an entire region of the world is effectively destroyed by the spread of her scarlet rot. If we can attribute these increases in power to their great runes, then it seems these shards of the Elden Ring allow each of the demigods to take some aspect of themselves and impose it on the world around them, a rule for many people. But wielding a great rune seems to be beyond the ability of ordinary people. At the beginning of the game, all of the great runes are in the possession of demigods, the direct offspring of God Queen Marika. Or at least that's what we're told by Aeneas, but there's an exception. Rennala, the Carian Queen. She is unrelated to Marika, and nonetheless is introduced as a shard-bearer. Rennala's rune, however, isn't held within her body, but within an amber egg that was given to her by Radagon, and this vessel may itself be a yet unborn demigod, for it bears the great rune of the unborn. What's more, it seems Rennala can't use this rune properly, because although it is said to perfect those reborn, all of the scholars that Rennala uses it on come out wrong. Notably, Renala's rune is also the only one named like this. Every other great rune is named after the demigod that claimed it, such as Morgoth's rune or Godric's rune. So I think this exception with Renala proves the rule, that the ability to act as the vessel of a great rune is directly connected to one's status as a demigod, categorically distinct from an ordinary person. In turn, the ability to bear the combined Elden Ring is what would make one a god. But wait, you might say, what about the other obvious exception, the player character, the Tarnished? How is it that we can slay demigods and claim their great runes for ourselves? The short answer is that we can't, at least not on our own. The game draws our attention to the fact that we begin maidenless, and implies that without a finger maiden to assist us on our quest is hopeless. Because of this, we can't even make use of ordinary runes to level up, until we meet Melina. Melina is a character ultimately implied to be a demigod herself, a child of Marika, and our ability to interact with runes depends on her. In order to use a great rune, we must do even more. We must take each great rune to the top of a divine tower and commune with a pair of fingers to restore its blessing. And then we need to sacrifice a rune arc each time we wish to invoke the blessing of that great rune. Even then, the rune doesn't truly become ours. In your inventory, it'll still be clearly labeled Morgoth's rune. And the blessing we get is a pale imitation of the power they were able to invoke from it. In short, we can only indirectly and temporarily tap into the power of a great rune, whereas demigods can attune to them and truly claim them as their own. Perhaps this isn't surprising, though. Ordinary runes are the rule set for a single living being, but a great rune forms a rule that can apply to many people, so it's too great for a single person to bear. Unless they're a demigod. But then, what makes Marika and her offspring so special? Why are they gods and demigods? Let's put the question another way. If an ordinary person cannot hold a great rune within them, what kind of being can? The bizarre answer is a being that is more than one person. One of the biggest reveals of Elden Ring's story is that Marika, the god of this world, and Radagon, the current Elden Lord, are the same person. And this seems to be more than a case of an alternate identity or a split personality, but two distinct people inhabiting the same body. The significance of this is difficult to make sense of, and it's easy to dismiss as just part of the surreal storytelling of From Software. But I think this feature of Marika isn't a quirk, but a fundamental part of what it means for her to be a god of the lands between. She is more than a person. She is a more complete being, because she can hold contradictory aspects within herself. In other words, she's an alchemical Rebis. One of the clear influences for Elden Ring is Hermetic alchemy. While pop culture tends to treat alchemy as a magical practice, the historical tradition of alchemy was a precursor to modern chemistry, and some notable alchemists, like Paracelsus, were early advocates for empiricism, encouraging readers to observe the natural world to better understand it. That said, there was definitely a current of mysticism underlying the thinking of most alchemists, and their conclusions will seem dubious to modern eyes. Still, if we look at the work of real-world alchemists, we'll find some of the inspiration for Elden Ring. First, consider the Rebis. Wikipedia's summary is a sufficient starting point for us. The Rebis is the end product of the alchemical magnum opus, or great work. After one has gone through the stages of putrefaction and purification, separating opposing qualities, those qualities are united once more in what is sometimes described as the divine hermaphrodite, a reconciliation of spirit and matter, a being of both male and female qualities, as indicated by the male and female head within a single body. The Rebis is sometimes treated as a synonym for the Philosopher's Stone, and other sources consider it a necessary step in the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. Either way, it's one of the greatest accomplishments an alchemist can achieve. Sources will also go on to clarify that the Rebis is an allegorical image, a representation of the abstract concept of unifying opposites. I believe that the creators of Elden Ring, however, imagined a world in which this concept was quite literal. The union of opposing elements, such as male and female, growth and rot, body and spirit, or the sun and the moon, is a recurring theme in Elden Ring. In particular, the fact that Radagon and Marika are the male and female halves of the same unified entity connects them to this great work of alchemy. Next, I want to consider sections of the Ripley Scroll, another attempt to describe allegorically how one could create a Philosopher's Stone. Interpreting the allegorical aspects of this scroll is a task for a specialist, but for our purposes, just consider the actual imagery presented. We see the essence of a thing, its blood, spread throughout the world. We see a great tower, at the top of which disparate elements of sun and moon, spirit and body, are being merged. We see people being mutilated and placed into jars, while old men watch expectantly for a divine creature to emerge. Again, these images have a coded meaning of their own, but if you've played the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, you may already start to see the parallels. If Marika is a Rebis, a union of opposites, then the Elden Ring is the Philosopher's Stone in this analogy, a stone which is said to be able to bring about eternal life and miraculous transformations. It's easy to go too far with this comparison, but the point I'm trying to make is that imagery and abstract concepts from Hermetic alchemy have informed the story of Elden Ring, and by imagining Queen Marika as a Rebis, as the endpoint of a long process, we can see that this is not a god that was born, but made. With these concepts in mind, we're almost ready to tell a story. The last thing we need to consider is the Elden Ring itself. We know that it is made up of great runes, forged together into a combined set of principles for all life, or at least all life that is bound to it by grace. As to its form, we know what the Elden Ring looks like, for despite its abstract nature, it has a physical representation, which we find visibly housed within Marika's body at the end of the game. We also know that the Elden Ring existed in the distant past, in the time when the Elden Lord was an ancient dragon named Placidusax. Between that prehistoric age and the time of the Golden Order, where was the Elden Ring? I think that it remained for unimaginable ages within the great golden tree that grew from the energy of the Crucible. The Crucible is said to be a primordial, vital energy from which life emerged, and the Crucible is credited with evolutionary gifts, or mutations, that randomly appear among the living creatures of the lands between. We know that a great tree grew from the Crucible's energy, the predecessor of the Erdtree, and I believe this tree was the vessel of the Elden Ring for eons. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that a tree was the natural form to emerge when the Elden Ring laid unclaimed for so long. Consider that when we die and drop our runes on the ground, a small spectral tree begins to emerge before we pick those runes back up. Notably, many trees in the real world are also hermaphroditic. They are both male and female. So, like Marika, a tree can naturally represent a union of opposites. In fact, if you look at the shadow tree from a specific angle in the realm of shadow, you can see that it has two bases, and the trunks twist together in a spiral shape. This tree is likely the remnants of the Crucible tree, now veiled in shadow, and its role as the predecessor of the Erdtree is why it's explicitly called the Shadow of the Erdtree. The fact that it is a tree made of two twisting trunks could represent the male and female aspects of this tree combining, making it a complete form of life that can serve as a vessel for the Elden Ring. If you look at the icon on your map with this in mind, it almost starts to look like two lovers embracing. In any case, now we can fast forward to the time of the Hornsent, who worshipped the Crucible as a chaotic source of primal energy, and who prized the horns that randomly sprouted on those who lived in the shadow of that great tree. Such growths were seen as a touch of the divine, blessings from the holy energy hidden away in their great tree. So imagine spending your whole life worshipping a great golden tree and the life-giving energy within it, and thinking, if only I could be so grossly incandescent. And now we begin our story. Because the scholars of the Hornsent culture weren't content to live in the shadow of this divine power. They wanted to become divine. The first attempt of the Hornsent to reach divinity was through asceticism, which we see in the tutelary deities and the ritual of the Horned Warriors. The Horned Warriors, despite their name, were learning martial skills largely in service of improving their ability to perform a ritual dance, and the greatest among them were selected to become lion dancers. The lion dancers are modeled after a traditional Chinese style of dance, in which two people work together to form a single creature, united by their performance. In Elden Ring, this dance can invoke the forces of nature, but the ultimate goal was greater still. Listen to the recitation heard when you enter the lion dancers' arena for the first time.
O horn-decked beast from higher sphere delivered, take root inside the tower-sculpted keepers, and perched within, we beg of thee, rise.
The beast from a higher sphere, referred to in this passage, is almost certainly the beast that literally fell from the heavens in a prior age, the Elden Beast, the last boss of the game, which is synonymous with the Elden Ring itself. Seeking to have this entity enter and possess the lion dancers is a prayer for ascension, for them to serve as the vessel for the Elden Ring, and therefore become gods. The fact that the lion dancers are, by their nature, two people becoming one through a ritual suggests that the logic of the Rebis was already in play. The Hornsent knew they needed a being who was more than one person in order to house the Elden Ring, and the use of a dance in their ritual might suggest an understanding that the language of creation is motion. And yet, for all of their strength and reverence, no lion dancers ever truly ascended. But, after asceticism failed to result in ascension, the Hornsent scholars discovered something else. A group of shamans who had a unique ability to commune with spirits and connect to other living things. We find the remains of one shaman who seems to have merged herself with a tree in the shaman village, and we can assume that this ability to physically meld with other living things was an important part of their spiritual practices. The Hornsent saw something else, however, a key ingredient for a new crucible. For if the shamans could meld with others, they could be the basis for creating a person who is more than one person, a Rebis. The crucible that the Hornsent worshipped was said to be a place where all life was once blended together. And in fact, the word crucible itself refers to a container where materials are melted together. The Hornsent took this concept and tried to create an artificial crucible in the most literal and horrific way possible, by merging people together inside of great jars. Since shamans have a unique ability to meld with other living things, they were used as the base for each jar while alive, and had countless other bodies, mostly the bodies of criminals, stuffed into the jars with them. In order to encourage the shamans to meld, they were whipped and mutilated beforehand, so that their bodies would try to heal together with the other flesh in the jar. We know all of this explicitly from the DLC, and we know that the jars were supposedly an attempt to raise the interred to sainthood. Many people in the lore community believe that this was just a ritualistic way of redeeming criminals. But I think it was an alchemical experiment, a direct attempt to merge the bodies and the runes of people together to create something new. And eventually, after an untold number of attempts, an untold number of atrocities, they succeeded in the great work and formed the Rebis, their very own vessel for great runes. We know there was a time near the end of Hornsent society when Marika was accepted and considered important, as there are statues of Marika throughout the Land of Shadow, her arms outstretched, as if offering comfort or a blessing to the people of this land. We also have various sources referring to Marika's betrayal, implying that she was in a position of trust, despite being a lowly shaman. If she was the long-awaited saint, the promise of Ascension nearly complete, then she would have been considered a sacred symbol in Hornsent culture. Marika was the promise of a greater, holier future for the Hornsent, so they prepared to complete the Ascension. I say the Ascension, rather than her Ascension, because we know the Hornsent created the Great Spiral Tower and the Gates of Divinity, but I believe they intended someone else to finish the ritual and gain power over the New Order. Marika was capable of burying great runes, but in order to tap into their power, they needed the same thing we do in-game, a rune arc. The rune arc is a shape that completes and empowers a great rune, for reasons that I'll discuss in a future episode. The point for now is that the Hornsent intended Marika to serve as the vessel for the Elden Ring, but not necessarily as a god, and certainly not as both god and lord. Indeed, the separate role of god and lord may have been part of the Hornsent's plan for the Ascension ritual, allowing Marika to be the source of power, but placing control in the hands of someone else that they could choose. But Marika betrayed the Hornsent, and stepping over a field of fresh corpses, she claimed all of the power of that ritual for herself, gathering the accumulated energy of the tower and the Gates of Divinity and pouring it into herself, becoming both vessel and god of a complete Elden Ring. So began the Golden Order, and so began the purge of the Hornsent, whose faith in the Crucible Marika mocked, by exterminating them using enormous furnace golems. The Hornsent had tormented Marika's people, and Marika chose to perpetuate violence instead of ending it. The golden age that followed was supposed to be eternal and perfect, but it was built upon suffering. And that suffering was forged into the very foundation of the world to come. So, what have we learned about Elden Ring? It is a story about the nature of creation and destruction. It is a story about cycles of violence. And it is a story about trying to understand something so distant you can only catch glimpses of it. Despite its fantastical and often surreal setting, it is about universal truths. There is much more to say, but I began with these concepts because I see them as foundational to everything else in our understanding of Elden Ring. Thinking of runes as fragments of a world-making language will give us a rich groundwork for understanding sacred geometries, and geometry is deeply important in a world where the language of creation is shape and motion. Meanwhile, the concept of the Rebis is a lens for us to dive deeper into the most pervasive theme of Elden Ring, duality. Finally, the idea that the fingers are a medium through which the people of the world attempt to communicate with a distant, unknowable will can lead us to better understand the cosmology of Elden Ring and its core artistic vision. These are each topics I intend to dive into deeper. If you want to hear more about a unified theory of Elden Ring, then like, comment, subscribe, and share with others. This is a new channel, so engagement will dramatically improve the odds that I continue and complete the theory. I want to acknowledge the value of the whole lore community, whose rigorous analysis of the individual items in Elden Ring over the years makes a broader analysis like the one I'm attempting possible. Until next time.